Thank you for joining us for the National Center for Rural Road Safety's October webinar entitled Understanding Transportation's Role in Rural Human Trafficking. Thank you all as well for the brief delay that we had and your patience in doing that. I appreciate your time today. We have some fantastic speakers for you today, so I'm going to go pretty quick through these logistics. As always, today's webinar will be an hour and a half. Closed captioning is available and the link has been put in the chat pod. It's also on the screen right now. Today's webinar will be recorded and will be on our website for archival purposes under ruralsafetycenter.org/webinar-archive. And you can find all of our previous webinars on that same page. We will be utilizing the question and answer pod today. So if you do have any questions for our presenters, please go ahead and put them there. You can also use this Q&A pod to alert the organizers of any technical difficulties that you may be having. We'll stop 3 times today for questions. Handouts will be available for download. It will take us a few extra minutes to get those up into the system, but they will be available by the end of today's presentation. We will have surveys that will come out at the end of the webinar. If you wouldn't mind filling those out, it just helps us know what additional topics you all may be wanting to hear as we're starting to get planning on our winter webinars. We'd love to have that feedback from you. And as always, certificates of completion will be sent to anyone who attends today's webinar for 75 minutes or more. Those certificates of completion are manually made and emailed, so it takes 3 to 4 weeks to receive those. You will get them from our events@ruralsafetycenter.org email address. There will also be an application for CEUs that will be attached to that. That needs to be filled out and returned to the Montana State University and not the Rural Road Safety Center. There is an email address on it for that. And if you joined us and received the one for September, you'll notice that it says a fee of $25. Please ignore that. We will send out a clarification email. All of these CEUs are free and already paid for by the center for you. Today's presenters will be Kristen Joyner from the Southwest Transit Association and Margot Hill from Eastern Washington University, and I'll read through their bios here in just a few seconds. Our goal of our webinar today is that once you've completed it, you'll have an understanding of transportation's role in rural human trafficking and how rural agencies can make their systems and passengers safer. To meet this goal, we have 3 learning outcomes for you. The first is to understand what human trafficking is and how it's affecting the transportation sector. The second is to identify how the industry can stop traffickers. And the third is to describe new resources for transportation industry regarding human trafficking. And at this point, I am going to turn our presentation over to Kristen Joyner. Kristen was invited to serve on Secretary of Transportation Elaine Chao's Advisory Council on Human Trafficking in 2019. The purpose of the Advisory Council was to research and produce a report for the United States Congress that would be working resource for all sectors and all modes of transportation industry, providing guidance that will enable people to take practical steps to end modern-day slavery. She has worked a majority of her career informing, educating, and fighting for women, men, girls, and boys who have been used by traffickers in local communities across the United States and exploited through our transportation system. And at this point, I am thrilled to turn our presentation over for Kristen to talk about some of the issues on a national basis. Kristen?
Wonderful. Thank you all so much for caring enough about this topic to be here. I do know that we had a poll that we were going to launch. Jamie, will that be now or later in the presentation?
You are correct here. Dana has pulled the poll up for us. So we do have 3 polls for you. I apologize for forgetting about that. Our first is, have you previously seen a presentation on human trafficking awareness? Yes or no? And we'll give everyone just a second here to vote. Okay, Dana, if you could please broadcast the results on this one. Thank you. So it looks like almost half, about 45%, have seen a presentation, and that will lead us to our next poll, please, Dana. And that one is, if you've previously seen a presentation on human trafficking awareness, what was that setting? The National Center for Rural Road Safety's July 2020 webinar, a DOT training, a local agency presentation or training, posters in the public arena, or I've never seen a presentation on this topic. And again, we'll give everyone just a few seconds to fill this out. Perfect, thank you. So it looks like the majority of you who have seen a presentation before, it's a local agency presentation, about 28%. About 15% have had training through the DOT, and only about 7% of you saw our previous webinar. So if you're interested at the end of today's webinar, on our archived webinar page, we do have that other human trafficking webinar that was done in July of 2020. So feel free to go back and take a look at that one as well. And then we have one final poll for you. And that is, which of these communities does human trafficking take place in? Rural, urban, tribal, all of the above, or none of the above? And about 98% of you say all of the above. So thank you for participating in those polls. That will help give our two presenters just a little bit background about where everyone is coming from. And now at this point in time, I will really turn it over to Kristen. Kristen?
All right, wonderful, thank you. I have been working in this space of human trafficking awareness for over 10 years. And I first learned about it when a woman that I met was trying to get people to understand the ministry that she and her husband provided. Her husband was in law enforcement in Dallas, Texas area. Actually, they lived in a rural part of Texas. But whenever there was a Cowboys game or a major event in the Dallas Metroplex, they would go to those events and pass out bars of soap. And I was just very curious about that. She explained that at large sporting events, that's a place where girls and women, boys and men can be trafficked for sex. And I want to tell everybody right now, this is going to be a PG-13 conversation. We don't stray too far off of that mark, but this topic is plaguing our nation, and we want to make sure that we're using the right terminology and we're really helping you understand what human trafficking truly is and how it is affecting the victims, how it's affecting actually the moral undergirding of our country, and how public transportation is used in that. So those are my personal goals for you, is that you will have a better understanding of all of that, and then how you can respond afterwards. So why the soap? Well, inside each bar of soap was a message that would hopefully speak to the person using it, and they would call for help or reach out in some way. Because if you think about it, a shower is a very private place typically, and what better place for someone who is being abused or being trafficked that they would be able to find a message, read it, and respond. So that was their thinking. As I left that encounter with this woman, I started thinking about, well, how do these people get to where they are going to be trafficked, and who's involved? And I very quickly understood that transportation is involved in one form or another. So I'll be showing some statistics on that. I'm having a little bit of trouble. There we go. Anytime I start out a presentation on this topic, I try to connect it to my personal mantra. And that mantra is, not on my bus, not on my train, not in my community. I'm hoping that as we go through this, that you will take this mantra on yourself And at the end, I'm going to ask you to repeat it after me. Even though I can't hear you, I think you saying those words, not on my bus, not on my train, not in my community, will help solidify for you that this is a fight that we can all join together in and do something about. So I'm asked, what is what is human trafficking? And there are two basic types. There's sex trafficking and there is labor trafficking. And within the labor trafficking, you typically find domestic servitude. So I'm going to start with the definition for sex trafficking, and that's when a person has committed a commercial sex act, and they are induced by force, fraud, or coercion. So I want you to say that out loud wherever you are, induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or in which the person induced to perform such an act has not attained 18 years of age. So what do those two things have to do with each other? Well, if a person is involved in a commercial sex act and they are claiming that they have been trafficked for sex, then if they're over the age of 18, they need to prove that it is, or show in some demonstrable way that there was force, fraud, or coercion. We'll talk about what those are here in just a bit. If the person is under the age of 18, it automatically is deemed human trafficking. The reason is that we know by research that our brains are not fully formed until about the age of about 24, 25 years. That part of the brain that allows us to reason and understand fully what is happening in a situation. So a teenager who is a runaway shows up at a transit center, some sort of a transfer situation, or maybe at a Greyhound bus station, and they look distressed, they look alone, and a trafficker walks up to them and says, "Girl, you are so beautiful. You don't need to be crying like that. I'll tell you what, I'm making a music video. You are so beautiful. I want you to star in my next music video." Well, what 14-year-old can process fully this person? I mean, I know we teach stranger danger, but a 14-year-old who has run away from home, who has maybe been already in an abusive situation, and is feeling lost and alone, somebody reaching out, saying something nice to them, to that girl, and she might respond in a way that that would not make sense to anyone else who's older. So, and by the way, I keep saying a 14-year-old because the average age of the person trafficked in the United States today, trafficked for sex, is a 14-year-old girl. Now, I want you to understand that it's not just girls, it is girls and boys, men and women. And we'll look deeper into that in a few seconds. The second form of trafficking is labor trafficking. And so the legal definition is the recruitment, harboring, everybody say it with me together, transportation, provision or obtaining of a person for labor or services through the use of force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of subjection to involuntary servitude, peonage, debt, bondage, or slavery. That is a whole lot of legal words. I'd rather show you what it could look like. So the top left corner, top right corner, and the bottom two on the bottom right corners, these could be what labor trafficking looks like. So it could be labor that involves children that it's too dangerous for them to be involved in. It could be construction work. It could be someone in a restaurant. It could be someone in hospitality. that's also domestic servitude. That's what it could look like. And as we're thinking about this, labor trafficking is not something that happens just in our big cities. It is something that is hiding in plain sight in every sector of our country, in rural, in tribal, and in our big cities. So in the bottom left-hand corner, without having to show a lot of things that have to do with sex trafficking, I chose this image because it could be something that's online, it can be something that is in person. It's a lot of things. And when you're sitting across the table from a 13, 14, 15-year-old in a police station, they've been picked up, they have not been charged because remember, they're under the age of 18, but they're telling you the things that have happened to them in a sexual nature that they're things I've never even heard of before. It's hard to define and hard to show, but this photo could be something that documents that. And I'd like to take this opportunity to say that pornography is just like trafficking is a multi-billion-dollar industry, so is pornography. And we think sometimes that the person on the other side of that screen or in that picture, in that movie, that they are willing participants. But I can tell you that the research shows us the majority are not willing participants, and even go so far as to say that the majority are children and teenagers that have been dressed up to look like whatever the fantasy is. So we no longer live in a society that says boys will be boys. We live in a society, at least the one that I live in, says that innocent people who are being trafficked, in no matter what form, it's not for our own gratification. It is wrong, and it is something that we need to attack. So that that top middle picture, I showed that one because there's only one thing that we actually brand in the United States, and that's our cattle, unless it's in the trafficking arena. And this one has a series of numbers. Sometimes you might see a tattoo that says Big Daddy. Sometimes and the wording is going to be different for each trafficker. It might be the trafficker's name. But barcodes can be used in the trafficking arena, just like you go into Walmart and buy a bottle of Tide and scan it across the scanner. You can actually use a barcode and an app on your phone to run it across that barcode and buy that person's services. And the exchange of money never takes place physically. So this will be the beginning of your understanding of what it looks like. But let's keep going on this. I always get the question, is this really happening? This particular heat map is from the Polaris Project. They are the keepers of the National Human Trafficking Hotline. And this shows where calls came from about human trafficking events that were suspected and then confirmed through these phone calls across the United States. Notice where all of the red hot masses are, but then I want you to notice that every single state that is shown on this map, all 50 states, have some form of calls coming into the National Human Trafficking Hotline. I know this is going to sound like a weird thing to say, but I would actually like to see the whole thing covered in red, to be honest, because what this means, the redder that it gets, means people are seeing something and they're saying something. The redder it gets, the sooner we're going to be able to take all of the red off of this map. But we've got to get to that place where people are seeing it, they are understanding what it is, and they're actually caring enough to do something about it. So more data from the National Human Trafficking Hotline, and this is a report from 2020. They're still gathering numbers, and it takes them just a little bit to get all the numbers put into the hotline mapping system. But in 2020, there were almost 30,000 phone calls to the hotline number. Now remember, we were not out and about in the community as much in 2020. And still, almost 30,000 phone calls, 13,000 texts, 2,900 online tips, 4,100 emails, and 1,600 web chats all came to that hotline number or the texting number. And I want to point out that the phone number looks kind of funny for a reason. It's because it makes it easier to remember. It's 888-3737-888. And that's a number that you can put into your phone and have it readily available. I was in two different rural settings in the last couple of years where I did make a report to the hotline. The first one, my husband and I were in a rural area and had to stop for gas. And there was a big truck that had had nothing on the sides of it. It had no license plate number. The back rolled up, and 6 men got out of the back of that vehicle. Inside the vehicle were all kinds of vegetables that had been picked, and there were no windows in the back of that truck. I mean, they came out and they were clearly thirsty and overheated and probably nauseated. But they were not allowed to go into the store. They had to stay right there at the truck while someone from the front of the truck went into the store. 2 other people from inside the front of the truck stood there with these 5 or 6 men to make sure that they didn't go anywhere. But that was my viewpoint on it. And so I immediately started texting the hotline number. What you do is in the message part, you put "be free," and in the phone number part, you put the 233-733. I was able to make that report. I was able to even slyly, I took a picture and sent the picture to the hotline. Now, at the time, there was not really a way to track to figure out, was something done about this? Were they able to catch these folks? But what did happen is I did my part. I made the report, and then, which by the way, the reports, the phone calls, they are answered 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And the hotline connects back to local law enforcement. So the second time that I had to report, I was actually in South Dakota. And there was a situation there at a hotel where a sign was on the outside of a hotel room door. On the inside of the hotel, it said no hospitality service, meaning they didn't want any fresh towels or anything. They didn't want anyone coming into the room. And then on the other side of that same hotel room, there was a door that opened up to the parking lot. And this part of South Dakota is where the Sturgis, the big Sturgis motorcycle rally is. And there are documented cases of human trafficking that take place each year at that Sturgis motor rally. That had just finished the week before. And I was in this hotel for several days because I was doing human trafficking awareness training for the transit agencies in North and South Dakota. During my time there, that sign never came down. I went to the front desk and asked to speak to the manager. I explained why I was there, why I was reporting this to them, and then also texting the National Human Trafficking Hotline to get law enforcement involved. Now you have to understand the sign was on the door for several days. And when the manager looked up the information at the hotel, there was a warning on that particular hotel room, which was very odd. Come to find out, it was not human trafficking. I did my part in reporting it. No one got into trouble, but it alerted the hotel that, gosh, we didn't even know that human trafficking took place around here. We didn't know what we should be looking for, or that sign was a very odd sign to have on there. So it really presented an opportunity for education. And I say all that to you because there are people, we know from a national study that is going to be released in January, that the reason that people don't say something is because they're afraid they're going to get it wrong. I tell people, go with your gut. Your gut has brain cells in it. And it's a lot of times when you have that gut feeling that something's off. And by the way, in that hotel room, something definitely was off. It just was not human trafficking. It was something different, entirely different. And the authorities got involved in that situation. But for me, I went with my gut. I didn't let my big brain talk my gut out of not reporting. I did the right thing. And that's really what we need to do. We need to report and then let the authorities take care of it. This reporting is totally anonymous. And again, I was in North Dakota for the first situation. The second situation was in a very rural part of North Carolina. Back to who is it that is being trafficked? There was a research project done of survivors of human trafficking. And this group, which was about 127 people, 86% were female, 12% were male. And then the question was asked, what age were you at your trafficking entry? If you look at the middle pie chart, you will see that the majority, so over 50%, were below the age of 23. So the bottom right-hand corner shows you 18 to 23. It was at 18 to 23 years of age, 18%. Another 18% was 12 to 17 years of age. And the really shocking thing is that 0 to 11 years of age, 17% of this group were trafficked somewhere between the age of a newborn and 11 years old. The other pie chart shows ages over the age of 29. And then immigration status, that's not really a connecting point. We want to think that it's people over there trafficking people over there to us, and that's not true. 77% of this group of survivors that were questioned, 77% were U.S. citizens or legal permanent residents. So in the same study, 42% of survivors stated that buses were used in the facilitation of their exploitation. And that's what I was talking about earlier when I was opening up, that that they have to get from point A to point B somehow. But the good news is that while public transportation is part of the problem, we are also part of the solution. 26% of the survivors reported that public transit played a role in at least one of their exit attempts. So that's really key to this whole discussion, is what can we do? But before we go there, I want to pass along. Well, we're going to go to some questions. I'm going to take some questions from you, I think, first. But I do want you to know that Margot is going to come in. She's going to talk about her work with missing and murdered Indigenous women. And then I'll come back and talk about a toolkit that is being created through an FTA grant for for our Indigenous population. So what questions do you have?
Thank you, Kristen. And so we do have one question that came in, and that is, how do we help a victim?
Okay, that's a great question. So let me tell you the don'ts first. The don't is, and the don't is don't walk up to somebody and say, hey, are you being trafficked? First of all, you might put them in danger and you might put yourself in danger. There are if you're encountering someone, especially if you are a rural bus operator, or maybe you're working at a truck stop, or you're working at I don't know, maybe a rest area, you might encounter someone that you could ask a question. Do you feel safe with the person that you're with? Do you do you know where you're going, and do you know the people who are going to be picking you up? That would be a good question for someone who is at a Greyhound bus ticket counter if they feel like something's off. But the key is you don't intervene. Use 911 and call if you feel like that there is a crime being committed right then. Otherwise, take mental note and contact the hotline. The second thing is there are local agencies who work directly with victims. So getting involved with those victims, help and education type non-governmental organizations, that is a way that you could volunteer, a way that you can give, a way that you can understand the victims better. And then the third thing is, most of the time, those who are involved in human trafficking, whether it's for sex or for labor, they don't really consider themselves victims. Especially in the sex trafficking arena, some of these folks have been abused for so long prior to even coming into sex trafficking that they kind of feel like that this lifestyle is something they might even deserve. So they don't really look at themselves as victims. So another don't is don't call them victims, but definitely get to know people in your community working directly with those who have survived and those who need education. So I hope that answers the question.
It does. Thank you very much. And we have one more that came in, and then we'll move to Margot. And that is there anything to be done about the demand for human trafficking?
Wow, that's an excellent question. Truckers Against Trafficking has a really good program on the demand side. And I'd like for it to be just as simple as just say no. One statistic that I know is that 1 in 4 men have been involved in one way or another in pornography. Pornography is one of those places where this starts. And I'll tell you a quick story. In Montana, there was a young girl who was sent to her uncle's farm, and it was just something that they did every single summer. She and her mom would go to her uncle's farm. When she turned about 10 or 11, her mom sent her there for the summer by herself, and that was when her grooming began by her uncle, as it related to her, them taking pictures of her, and then it involved taking pictures of her and a cousin. and then by the time she was 11 or 12, she was sent back to the farm every single summer. So when she was about 11 or 12, they had fully groomed her to then start conversations with people online. From there, she was trafficked in a horse trailer to rodeos all across Montana, Idaho, North and South Dakota, Colorado, by this uncle. And every year before her mother would send her, she would beg, please don't send me. And she was telling her mother what it was that was going on with her. And her mother's answer was, this is, everybody has their part in the family, and this is your part. This is your job to help support the family. This young girl spent every summer until she was 17, and she would go back to school in the fall, and she wouldn't talk about what had happened because she thought that she was doing what the family needed her to do. And when she was 17, she collapsed in school, went to the nurse's office, and the nurse, who had been trained in this field, asked her the right questions, and she ended up getting her the help that she needed and prosecution for the uncle and the different people that were involved. And you know what? I think I went off on that story, and now I can't remember what the question was. But Jamie, can you repeat the question for me?
It was, is there anything to be done about the demand for human trafficking?
Okay, so the point is that there was demand all along the way. There was a demand for pictures, there was a demand for conversations, there was demand for physical sex all along the way in this girl's life. And the demand has got to be taken care of on two fronts. One is a legislative front, the other is an addiction front. And just early on teaching about the fact that these are humans and this is not the way that we treat humans. I am not an expert on the demand side. There are others that are, and I will provide some resources about that, because the demand side is truly where we have to attack this before it can get better.
Thank you, Kristen. And I know you'll be joining us a little bit later to provide us with some resources as well. And now we're going to hear from Margot Hill. Margot is a Spokane tribal member who grew up on the Spokane Indian Reservation. She served as the Spokane tribal attorney for more than 10 years and as the Coeur d'Alene tribal court judge. As such, she received letters from the U.S. Attorney's Office in Washington State in which it declined to prosecute cases of major violent crimes as she worked to bring perpetrators to justice in the complex criminal law scheme of Indian country. And her fight for justice continues, and we're really excited to have her with us today to talk about some of those things. So Margot?
Heo putis kasihu putis kweli putis luchalacht Louise Quest, Margot Hill. Hello and good day, everyone. My name is Margot Hill. My Indian name is Tzip Ani, and I'm pleased to share with you a little bit about murdered missing Indigenous women and how that relates to human trafficking. As was mentioned, I served as our tribe's attorney for 10 years and worked on criminal cases, and there were violent crimes. And I'm going to talk about the legal jurisdictional issues. This is the intersectionality of rural communities in Indian country. And as Kristen mentioned, we can all do our part. And I'm hoping by understanding some of the complex jurisdictional issues, you can understand about how transportation planners and transportation staff can really assist in putting a stop to human trafficking. I grew up on the reservation. Indigenous women, have been victimized since colonization. And so I'm going to give you a little bit of an insight to some of the issues that happen in Indian country, and then into the rural towns as well as urban areas. Some of the stuff we talk about can trigger, so take care of yourself if this causes any issues for you. Our tribal elders request that we don't just start out with statistical data, but a statement as that Indigenous people have suffered historic injustices. I'm not going to read all these statements, but understand that these are real people. These are somebody's daughter. This is somebody's nephew. This is somebody's auntie. And so they're individuals with humans that have a right to life, their physical and mental integrity, liberty and security of persons. As Indigenous people, we should have the collective right of freedom, peace, and security. The Department of Justice recognizes the unique legal status and relationship with federal Indian tribes. The United States, our Constitution, our treaties, federal statutes, executive orders, all define this unique legal and political relationship that exists between the United States and Indian tribes. As transportation planners in rural communities, you are familiar with the very complicated legal issues that happen in our rural towns, on our roadways. Often the county and state have jurisdiction into Indian reservations and tribal communities. And so we're going to talk about all of those issues. And I have a short period of time, about 25 minutes, so I'm going to move quickly. And just to follow along Kristen's lead, giving you some information on national human trafficking. It's sex, it's labor, it's sex and labor. One thing that was really very resilient during the pandemic was human trafficking. It didn't just stop. How does it happen? In our rural communities, in our tribal communities, it's often online recruitment. During the lockdowns, you see a lot of victims are being sucked in by recruitment sites. There's strip clubs, individuals in foster homes, in schools. All of these, the internet really reported it was the top recruitment form of trafficking. Sometimes it's Facebook, reports on Facebook. Other times it's Instagram. You have technologies that disappear. So even if parents are checking technology, it can disappear. So human trafficking is highly personable. Sometimes it's family members, it's intimate partners. Among the forms of trafficking, the recruitment relationship was known. A good percentage, a good proportion of the victims were recruited by family members or caregivers, and this increased significantly. As the example that Kristen gave, maybe it's your uncle or an auntie, and in addition to family members, we see the proportion recruited by intimate partners jump 21%. So it's people that we trust and that we love or we're dependent upon for a roof over our head. These are people that are supposed to take care of us and look out for us. And so these people often get trafficked by people they know. It doesn't happen in a vacuum. There's vulnerability. The trafficker preys upon it. They see people that are vulnerable. Maybe they're in a foster home and they're a runaway or homeless. They have unstable housing. There's lots of people in our rural communities and our tribal communities that have unstable housing. We are seeing increasing housing prices across the country. and your middle and low income people just cannot keep up with the housing rates. I teach in urban and regional planning, and affordable housing is shrinking, and it makes it real tough. There's mental health issues. We are not keeping up with the demand, and substance abuse issues. All of these issues make people more vulnerable to traffickers. So the National Crime Information Center reports that there were 5,712 reports of missing American Indian and Alaska Native women and girls. This is from the FBI database. At the same time, U.S. Department of Justice's missing persons database, NamUs, only logged 116 cases. So we see this disconnect where we're just not getting the data and information to track these cases, to search for these people, to help law enforcement. The Centers for Disease Control has reported that murder is the third leading cause of death for Indigenous women. And the rates of violence on some reservations can be up to 10 times higher than the national average. And this is from a report from Urban Indian Health Institute, Seattle Health Board. Just a few more data points. More than 4 in 5 American Indian and Alaska Native women have experienced violence in their lifetime. 56% experienced sexual violence, 55% physical violence, 48% experienced stalking. Psychological aggression, the survey found that 1/3 of American Indian women will be raped in their lifetime. I was in court yesterday with a family relative who, was beat up by her boyfriend, had the restraining order. Somehow the charges were dropped. It's just really hard to understand how this happens, and to track the data. Most of it goes unreported. And I can tell you that the National Institute of Justice funded an analysis. And how did they get that data? From death certificates. And again, that Native women are murdered at a rate 10 times more than the national average. Here in Washington State, we work closely with the Washington State Patrol, and my partner and I wrote a letter to our tribal council. I talked to our chairwoman, and the tribal council said, why not get this letter out to other tribes? The Washington State Patrol had proposed tribal liaisons. They hired and set to work the Western Washington in United States, or in Washington. So that's Seattle, King County. But because of COVID, the funding was dropped for Eastern Washington, east of the Cascades. And we're like, hey, we've got needs here even more. If you look at Yakima County, there is the highest rate of missing and murdered Indigenous folks. And so we went to tribal leadership and ATNI. That was on a Monday. Tuesday, the letter went out to other tribes. By Wednesday, the proposal, I drafted a resolution for affiliated tribes of Northwest Indians. That's 57 tribes in Oregon, Idaho, and Washington. That resolution went to the floor by Patricia Whitefoot on Thursday. By Monday, the supervisor of the tribal liaison was in her office saying, we vetted a person for Eastern Washington, let's get that person hired. So we can make a difference. These tribal liaisons work closely with law enforcement to identify youth from the tribal communities that have run away, or where the last location. Sometimes Native families are reluctant to talk to law enforcement because there's trust issues, but we're working to build trust across jurisdictions, across communities. So we keep close tabs on the individuals that are missing. This list comes out once a month. It states the individual that went missing, their age, the date they went missing, and then the police department that someone can contact with a phone number. And so we're working really hard across our tribal communities and working in conjunction with Washington State Patrol and their tribal liaisons. I work of course, I'm a professor, but I'm on the board at the American Indian Center. And tribal communities move back and forth from our rural reservation lands to urban areas. The reservation lands that we retained for ourselves are often poor in geography. They're the lands that nobody else wanted, the settlers, the farmers. And so we have issues with having strong economies. And so we often have to go to the city for jobs, for education, for basic services. So you can see here by this map, we met with the staff at the American Indian Community Center here in Spokane, Washington, and we said, can you show us the tribal members that you're serving here at the American Indian Community Center? And they did this connection, and you can see that many tribal people move back and forth from the city to their rural tribal communities, and that mobility implication. Spokane is one of the largest urban centers between Seattle and, let's say, Minneapolis. And you can see that movement kind of in action. As mentioned, I served as the tribal attorney and worked with the U.S. Attorney's Office. Often I received letters of declination, meaning they were declining prosecution. There were issues of rape of 16-year-old girls in the back of the pickup truck with a gun to their head. There were violent crimes of husbands against wives being dragged naked, and just violent crimes. There were molestations, and we worked really hard to improve our law and order code and work with like professionals, KC family partners, to have interviews that would hold up in court. Nevertheless, there were violent crimes that continued to get declined. There was one case where a drug dealer had a razor in her hair and sliced somebody from ear to ear, and it required 72 stitches. Because of the complex nature of jurisdiction in Indian country, we don't have jurisdiction over major crimes. So if there's a major crime like murder, rape, arson, the FBI has to investigate and the U.S. attorneys have to prosecute. So when a cop arrives on the scene, they have to determine what's the land tenure. So, kind of that bottom graphic on the left, is it fee property? Is it trust property? That will tell you, is an indicator, an element for jurisdiction. Who is the perpetrator? The top, the right graphic, is it tribal or non-tribal? If it's a non-Indian, then we don't have jurisdiction because of a 1978 case called Oliphant. We have to call the local sheriff's office. And from Whelpinut, where I grew up, the local sheriff is an hour away in Colville. And many rural communities are so strapped for resources, particularly law enforcement, that we have to wait over an hour for somebody to show up, and sometimes they don't send anybody, right? So it matters. The land tenure, is it fee or trust property? And we have one housing development that is half fee and half trust. I'm not joking. Like, I can't make this stuff up. Is the perpetrator tribal or non-tribal? And then lastly, what's the crime? If it's a major crime, then the FBI has to come in and do the investigation, and the U.S. Attorney's Office has to do the prosecution. We don't ask for these complex criminal jurisdiction schemes. And in fact, it's even, if I were to give you a federal Indian law discussion, it's even more crazy. We've seen the Oklahoma McGirt case, saying all of the territories in Oklahoma was Indian country, and then which freaked people out. And then we seen the U.S. v. Cooley case, which recognized tribal law enforcement, their ability to hold and detain. There was a case where a guy was pulled over on the side of the road, and it was 1 or 2 in the morning. He had a toddler in the back seat. He was speeding, so the tribal cop pulled him over. And then the perpetrator challenged the jurisdiction of the tribal cop. But the Supreme Court found that tribal cops had a right to stop and detain. Again, there were drugs in the back seat, there were guns, there was a toddler. The tribal police officer had the authority to stop and detain. This kind of suspect behavior and call in other law enforcement. We've got to be able to protect our rural and tribal communities, and we don't have enough law enforcement as it is, and so these are major issues. And then we have new cases, Castro versus Huerta, which I don't have the time to talk about, but all of us as transportation planning officials can help with awareness. We work with WashDOT and transit agencies. We do trainings for folks that work at truck stops and rest areas and bus stops. As Kristen mentioned, Truckers Against Trafficking is an app that we really appreciate. And if we are all collaborating with each other and law enforcement, we have a better chance to stop these traffickers. There are special task forces working right now across rural and tribal communities. Invisible No More is a task force that's working under Secretary Deborah Holland, who's a Laguna Pueblo tribal member, to stop some of the trafficking that's happening. State DOTs, you can harness the potential of your employees and use technology to fight trafficking. We want to give you some of those resources. We will be providing in the chat or sending out some links to articles that you can share out. Please share out with all your employees. As Kristen put up the cover page of TRB, an article that I drafted, and gives you more of these details in writing. So again, we're trying to understand how this happens. It's happening in urban communities as well as rural. And I'm going to low on time, so I just want to begin to finish up. Indigenous people, once, the United States, pushed natives onto reservations, then they said, oh, no, we want to relocate you to urban cities. We want to assimilate you into the great melting pot. And so tribal people were moved clear from, their homelands, Alaska Natives into Seattle, Washington Natives down to California. We were relocated in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. My grandparents were relocated to Seattle, where my mother was born. And so we were, uprooted from our homelands, put in urban areas. And so we have large urban populations, but we often go home to our rural tribal communities. When you think of patterns of travel, often vulnerable communities, low-income populations, we don't have access to transportation. Of course, tribal transit is working to provide transit. These are my daughters. They are fully expected to go back to the reservation, spend time with their grandparents, to participate in ceremonies, to be in the tribal community. My daughter Sadie with her grandpa, her Papa Buzz, and my daughter Patty with Inez Hubert, one of our tribal elders. Our systems of travel are not keeping our Indigenous women safe. If you're interested in reading, I highly recommend Jessica McDermott's Highway of Tears. It tells the story of First Nations in Canada. It talks about specifically the transportation issues, and there's not just young white males abducting or using women, but there was also a serial killer and also a judge that preyed upon young Indigenous women. I myself was down at the bus station. As a single parent, my kids were in college. I was taking my son to the Greyhound. We didn't have a lot of money. He was riding the bus back to Seattle. And there's an Indigenous woman out there, and she looks upset, and I'm like, can I help you? And she's crying, and she said, my phone is dead. My mom was trying to buy me a bus ticket. She was having trouble with the credit card. Her mom was trying to buy it online. So there's factors that come into play. I just want to show the Venn diagram that shows some of the issues for Indigenous women. I think my PowerPoint has froze. I'm going to skip past Idela's story, but please, in the links that we're going to provide you, the Frontiers article specifically, Idela is a co-author, and so we tell the story about multiple jurisdictions, her sister passing her auntie, and this is an epidemic. So please read Idela's story in the Frontiers article that we're going to provide you. So I'll begin to wrap up here. There's still structural discrimination. As I've described some of the legal processes and jurisdictional issues, we don't ask for these laws in Indian country. Public policies and institutional practices, cultural representations. Many of you see, the Pocahontas with a sexy off the one shoulder short dress. We don't look like that Indian country. Our buckskin dresses go down to our ankles. We have cuffs and leggings and cover our bodies. There's still law enforcement norms that think women are prostituting because they want to, or they're drug addicts, or like somehow victims are asking for this. That's not the case. They're being beat. They're being threatened. Their family members are being threatened. Often, in our tribal communities, we don't have banks. People don't rush out and set up banks in Indian country. So we still have cash systems. We lack resources. On an individual level, there's poverty. There's not stable housing. Because of the land tenure, it's hard to get loans to have construction, to build homes on our reservation. Maybe it's educational. We're exposed to violence or sexual assault. There's addiction issues, emotional abuse, mobility safety. We don't have a lot of mechanics in our tribal communities. And then in our tribal communities, more poverty, violence, addiction, loss of land, culture, language. These are all contributing factors. So just looking at some of the critical issues of tribal jurisdiction, a shortage of law enforcement, poor relationship, prejudice, these issues, but we're working to begin to work with other organizations, make sure the media covers these cases. In rural communities, traffickers directly recruit the victims that are, you see them getting them through social media, preying on them. We're training medical staff to healthcare professionals so they can identify. There was a case in Alaska, a charter boat fishing captain. There's a really good report in Oregon that I referenced in the articles. We need legislation. Our tribal communities are passing tribal codes that protect children from human trafficking. We're not going to prosecute the victims, but get them services. BAWA, Violence Against Women Act, was once again reauthorized. So we have some jurisdiction in Indian country over non-Indian violators. So there's a number of things that we're working on. I could give you more examples, but I just want you as transportation officials, and I'll go ahead, and that's about my time, to know that we are doing all we can to work across jurisdictions. Please know that, individuals that have already been victimized, they're in foster care, are more vulnerable. And today, the U.S. Attorney's Office are responding to these cases. We had a case where a young child was assaulted and the perpetrator fled to Canada. He was prosecuted. And there are lots of activities in our tribal communities. We need standardized protocol, but we also need transportation officials just to do your part. I'm going to stop and let see if we have any questions. Thank you so much for participating in our webinar today. And so do we have questions so far in the chat?
And at this time, we do not have any questions. So if anyone has questions for Margot, please go ahead and add those to our question pod. We will have one more section for questions that we can take at the end as well, in case any of those come in. I do want to mention again that the chat pod, we've been posting a lot of resources into the chat pod, so please take a look at those. a few of the ones that that Margot has written, I put in at the very beginning, and then I just uploaded a few that both Kristen and Margot had talked about. So please pull those down if you're interested in following in those links. And at this point in time, I'm going to see, Dana, if you can move us forward in the presentation. Perfect. Thank you so much. And so Kristen is going to come back and join us and talk a little bit about the resources. And again, we'll have one more question and answer period. So if you do have questions for either Kristen and Margot, please feel free to put those in the Q&A pod at any time. So Kristen?
Yeah, so before I move forward on the slide, I want to take time to just say that there are signs, there are red flags, and I will be sharing some links, more links with you in the chat pod. But then the National Human Trafficking Hotline, their message is you can learn a lot by knowing someone's story. But they may be, and it's learning about the vulnerabilities. Margot talked about many of those, facing poverty. Someone in their life is addicted to drugs or alcohol, or they are addicted to drugs or alcohol. They're living in an unstable situation. They have previously experienced violence or sexual abuse. They're a runaway involved in the juvenile justice system. Sometimes it's because they're undocumented immigrants. And also people of color and the LGBTQ community are both higher per capita to be trafficked than most people in the United States. So knowing someone's story and knowing their vulnerabilities will allow you to key into what are those things that could set them up, and then the red flags start showing up if something's there. The Texas. Yeah.
Kristen, I was just going to ask, because you mentioned the human trafficking reporting hotline, that is one of the questions that came in, and because you're talking about that, I do want to ask this one right now before we move forward. But is there a separate contact number for human trafficking that falls under tribal, or would you use that same phone number that you mentioned earlier?
What we have found is the best number to call overall or to contact is the National Human Trafficking Hotline. The problem, again, is what Margot talked about when it comes to jurisdictional issues. I will say that I met a woman, another woman in Montana who was with tribal police. She worked undercover for the FBI, and she was sent on a job. Okay, so she was, again, she was undercover, was taken from Montana to Michigan, and so when you're talking about Native people, it is and really anybody, it's going to be crossing jurisdictional lines, whether it's a county, whether it's a state, but then the difficulties with the heightened difficulties with tribal jurisdictions. The first place really to start is to report at the National Human Trafficking Hotline, because we need to see and track where are the hot spots happening. A lot of times traffickers will work in rings, and they will move from one major city to another or one major area to another. And law enforcement has figured out that if they can see that there's heightened activity, say in Houston, and that it's going towards Denver, just by these different reports that they're getting in from the National Human Trafficking Hotline, they're able to piece together, okay, where are they going to go after Denver? So that's why that is a first point of contact. Margot, I'm going to defer to you. I haven't heard of anything else within Indian country that has been developed for this, but I'm going to ask you to answer that question.
Yeah, so that's a great question. We recently had some tribal member from the Lummi tribe go missing down in Las Vegas. There was some trouble. I think she might have ended up in jail. Some family came home. She ended up, there were people that befriended her, to purposely like, hey, we have a place that you can stay, and then she was trafficked. And every time, she would ask a tourist for their phone, and she would call home, and then a pimp or somebody would grab the phone from her, and she'd get cut off. And so we need law enforcement to work together. We were the folks at Washington State Patrol and the national hotline. They were trying to get this individual listed as a missing persons, and so the U.S. Attorney's Office would get involved with the case, and there was local law enforcement that was not going to be told how to do their job and got pretty crappy. Are you telling me how to do my job? So, making the call, getting the person's name listed if they go missing, gives other authorities an opportunity to get involved, right? To send out resources when the person calls home, that somebody will immediately go to that location, and we have a better chance of rescuing individuals that are being trafficked. But it really takes all of us. And Kristen, I would say the national hotline is still the best, and Truckers Against Trafficking. And then if you're in any of the calls through 911 in our state, will get routed through Washington State Patrol, which will flag our tribal liaisons. But that's a great question.
There are, each state, through the Attorney General's office, there are great efforts being made with law enforcement, with those who are actively in the anti-trafficking movement, to train the boots on the ground, whether it's law enforcement or it's transit agency personnel, truckers, to see something and say something. I have this slide here. This it says, "What can we do?" Gosh, my little white bar doesn't show up, so you can't really see that it says, "What can we do?" But these are 4 transit drivers in Louisiana who had an opportunity to go through a mobile training unit that was developed by Truckers Against Trafficking to teach about the signs, how to report, and also provide understanding of the situation so that empathy is there. A lot of times there is prejudice involved when you see someone acting out. In Oklahoma City, this happened just at it was the beginning of this year. Oklahoma City bus driver had someone get on the bus, and the woman was acting erratically. The other riders on the bus were telling the bus driver he needed to pull over and make her get off the bus. But he had training in 2 areas. One was empathy training, and one was on human trafficking awareness. He had gone through the busing on the lookout training. And he realized that there was more to her story, and just putting her off the bus did not feel right in his gut. So he told the woman to come sit right behind him, that he would be taking her to the transfer center, and that there he would be able to hear her story and really understand better what she was trying to communicate, because she was acting very erratically. Most of the time, a bus driver would just pull over and have the person get off if the other passengers are feeling uncomfortable. That seemed to settle her down, and he knew what the protocol was. He radioed ahead and had a manager there. The manager came on board, and again, because of training that this person had had through some empathy training and the busing on the lookout training, she was able to ask the right questions. They helped this woman get off of the bus and safely get into the transfer center in an area where law enforcement, they were able to come and talk to her and take her information and story, because she felt like she was being followed by her trafficker. She had just escaped, and she didn't really know what city she was in or where she was. But because of the quick thinking of the bus operator, because of training, because of communication protocols, this woman ended up getting the help that she needed. And the bus driver and the supervisor and the manager were all given the Harriet Tubman Award, which is the highest anti-trafficking award that you can get. That was given in May. I tell that story because that's really what the process is about. How can we help and what resources are there? I always tell transit agencies, but also DOTs, anyone working like at rest areas, anywhere that you're working in a rural area, you need to make sure that you have protocols in place for reporting, and you communicate those to your employees. Another thing is, in addition to the policy, you need to know what to look for. I've already given you some information about signs to look for, about that it starts with vulnerability and someone being in a vulnerable situation. And then once you have a plan, you know what to look for, it's knowing then how to report it. I'm getting to that in just a moment, but I want to show you some ways that transit in particular, they are doing what they need to do. In Oklahoma, we have taken a city bus and we've converted it into a rolling classroom by way of a FTA grant. This is something that really anyone can apply for once you see it come out. This was a grant called Crime Prevention and Public Safety that FTA put out before COVID. We hadn't been able to work on it until just recently, and this bus just launched this last week. But Embark is who donated the vehicle. The inside is being transformed into a classroom, and this is the artwork that is on the outside, communicating that this is public safety, public transit for public safety, and also that anyone can be a victim of human trafficking, man, woman, boy, girl, doesn't matter what your nationality is, what your sexual orientation is. But this ROC classroom, Rolling Oklahoma Classroom, I think is going to be instrumental in really changing things along that I-40 corridor in Oklahoma, to bring awareness all across Oklahoma. Inside the bus is artwork that's been created by 12 to 18-year-old girls who have been trafficked in Oklahoma, which makes it particularly significant. So we like to talk about survivor-informed information. And that's what we're doing with that artwork. Then survivor-informed also has to do with Busing on the Lookout and information that Busing on the Lookout has put out. This is a toolkit specifically for transit agencies, and we'll make sure that you get links to that. Inside the vehicles, there is survivor-informed messaging on posters. There's a whole campaign that's getting ready to roll out in January. I'm so excited to have been a part of this project, but it's going to focus on labor trafficking in particular. These that you see here are more oriented towards, it could be sex trafficking or labor trafficking, but notice it's in English and in Spanish, and these are put out by Busing on the Lookout, as is this sticker that you see that can give a very quick way for a driver or someone at a rest area or someone at a truck stop a way to call and report. This infographic is brand new and shows the relationship between urban, rural, and tribal communities as it relates to both sex trafficking and labor trafficking. This is one that we have just developed and will be out in January, along with some videos as well as posters for inside the bus and at bus stops. So how will you report again? You use the hotline number, and I want to just close by saying again, and you repeat after me, not on my bus, not on my train, not in my community. And this is my contact information. So Jamie, I'm going to give you control. I know we're needing to come to a close and there may be some more questions.
Perfect. Thank you. And thank you to both Kristen and Margot for all of the information that they've passed along. A few of the questions that we received is about being able to have a copy of these slides and also receiving an email with the links that I posted in the chat pod. So we will get that information out to you. I'm unsure whether or not the PDF was ever able to be uploaded, but we will shoot both of those out to you in an email. It will just be a few days before we get the email list of attendees, but we will send those out. I do have just a few slides that I want to go through, and there is one more question for Kristen and Margot that I'm going to hold here for a second just so that I can give you all some information on a few upcoming announcements. I just need control of the mouse, please. Perfect. So real quick, just a few announcements for you all. We will be having a November webinar that's still the date to be announced, but it will be on GHSA's brand new Rural Road Safety Report. So we hope that you'll all join us for that one. We will send an email to our distribution list when registration is open. Also a reminder that our Road Safety Champion program is running every Thursday through November 17th from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern time, and you can sign up on our website for that. You do not have to attend all 7 of those. You can pick and choose which ones you'd like to attend, and we will be running those again in the spring for any that you may miss. Importantly, the Federal Highway Administration has a local and tribal road safety match program, and they're hosting a Meet the Mentors virtual event. There will be 2 times this is given. On October 26th and on November 8th from 11 to 1. There are some restrictions and registration details for these webinars. It's free and limited to local and tribal agencies only on a first-come basis. Only 1 registration per agency. For the benefit of active participation, each event is limited to 50 attendees. And if registration is full, you'll be added to a wait list. So I do want to make sure that you all don't wait to register. If you're interested in learning more about the match program and how this could work, please do sign up for that. I will include the announcement for this in the email that I send out to everyone. And then additionally, I would like to point out that from November 14th to 18th is Crash Responder Safety Week. And I've put the link here for that in case you'd like to participate in anything that will be happening that week. And November 20th is World Day of Remembrance for Road Traffic Victims. So again, there's some social media campaigns, some events that will be happening. So we encourage you all to go and look for this information. So I'm gonna leave us on our contact information, and I am gonna follow up with this one additional question that we got in. And so Margot and Kristen, you guys can let me know who would like to start off with answering this. The question is, I've heard of trafficking victims using signs to signal that they're being trafficked. For example, giving someone a spoon springs to mind. Are any of these consistent across the country and things we should immediately recognize?
So I will go ahead and take that. This is Kristen. We've seen a lot of things on TikTok and on in different social media. There isn't a national norm, and again, most people. I know that there's this famous story about someone doing a sign out of a car window and they were stopped. I don't know if that was true or not. I think the key is that if your gut tells you there's something off, then report it. That's the best thing. And there's probably not going to be some universal sign or signal. As much as we would like that, most trafficking victims are not going to walk up and say, "I'm being trafficked, please help me." They need us to be eyes and ears for them and report.
We did receive two more questions, so I'll go through these really quick as well. The first one is are there additional trainings that you guys can recommend that are more detailed, such as how to have empathy, how to recognize the signs? Are there other places you would point people to for additional training on this topic?
This is Margot. I will just mention that there are pretty detailed examples in our articles. I think you're sending out the link. There's the National TRB Academy of Sciences magazine article. There's also a state DOT disrupting human trafficking article, as well as we just recently published in an article in the Frontiers. And we're going to provide those links out, but take a look at those. Those give you some pretty detailed explanation. Also, there are a number of national surveys that Federal Highways or Department of Transportation is looking to put out, and Kristen mentioned the one that's going to be coming out in January. Yeah.
And National RTAP hosts the Busing on the Lookout 30-minute training on their website. And you can take that training and get a certificate that you've taken the training. You can also go to Busing on the Lookout or BOTL, BOTL.org, and find that 30-minute training online. And I think that's a really good place to start. There, the opening scene is a woman who says, "I'm at the bus stop where I first met my trafficker," and know that they truly are using informed information from survivors in that video training.
And I will include that link that Kristen just mentioned in the email that we'll send as well. So our very last question, and then we're going to go ahead and get wrapped up, is do you see people reluctant to help those possibly being trafficked due to feeling they're being scammed?
I can't speak really. I can't speak to that in terms of a research. I do know. I think people don't know what to do. And so that's why the training is so important, that they know how to report, so that it goes into the hands of the professionals that then can follow up correctly. That's my best answer.
And the Truckers Against Trafficking app, you can just report what you see, a vehicle, a license plate, the place and the time, and then somebody else can follow up and assess the threat. Or, I mean, if it's happened once at that location, it's likely that's a common location. And so if we're reporting this will get officials on notice.
So I do want to thank again Margot and Kristen. It was a fantastic webinar. I know I learned a lot. I hope that you all did too. The handouts are available currently in the handout pod to go ahead and download, but again, we will be sending those via email. The recording for this will be posted within a week on our website. So thank you again, Kristen and Margot, and everyone have a fabulous day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.